Hey guys, welcome back. So now, coming back from a bit of a holiday break, and we're jumping back into the Darkhold stories with the Darkhold Spider-Man one-shot. So where in this one we see what story that Peter was given to drive him crazy enough to undergo his transformation and join the others in stopping Chthon. And very appropriately, this story is called Tensile Strength, and we'll get into why that name is perfect as we make our way through this discussion. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squad up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so for this one, as we get into the Darkhold story for Spider-Man, and we take a peek into the narrative of like what twisted Peter's mind when he read a portion of the Darkhold, and his story takes us to New York in the aftermath of an event called the Unraveling. But also as we jump into the story for Peter, he's on a phone call with his wife, Gwen Stacy. And right away, this is one of those things with these Darkhold one-shots that kind of gets me. Because like what we talked about before, with these stories getting into the heroes' minds and driving them into madness, to where it then uses chaos magic to transform their bodies. And like the kicker, to me at least, is with that being the case, that these stories come from a place to where some of these thoughts had to be in the back of their mind. And granted, there was a time when Peter and Gwen Stacy did get married, though at the time it was outside of continuity, back when Marvel started initially allowing other countries to print their own translations of Spider-Man, which in some cases got completely different stories, like in Mexico for instance, when they started printing twice as frequently and throwing in a lot of different plot threads, which caused a lot of things to play out differently than the Spider-Man history that we're familiar with. And in a way, it kind of does seem like a nod to that, but also with this Darkhold story just hitting the ground running with Peter and Gwen married, and it kind of makes you think like, man, I could imagine Peter having those thoughts in the back of his mind, at least to some degree, where he'd wonder how their life would have been had she never died. And I like pieces like that get thrown in. But this story for Peter, it's so much more than just that. Because on one hand, you do have Gwen telling Peter don't be late for their anniversary, and her also telling him on his way home to pick up some vinegar, which right away gives out the vibes of like, this is what your conventional nightmare is kind of made of. Because I'm not sure if any of you have ever had this dream or this nightmare to where on one hand, it's like the end of the world, but then also while the world is ending, for whatever reason in your dream, you also got to get your homework done. And it's like, really, like if the world was really ending, who would care about homework? And that's kind of the situation we see Peter in here, because with this event called the Unraveling, which is just causing everything to fall apart, Peter finds himself webbing all over the place in an attempt to hold as much together as he can. And as far as the specifics of how this event started, we're not given a definitive reason, though early on Peter does mention that Reed Richards suggested that it might have been something dealing with the Molecule Man, but even still we don't know for sure. But instead we just dive in with Peter trying to web everything and hold it all together, but also he has to meet with his wife Gwen at 7:30. Oh, while also picking up the vinegar on the way home. I almost forgot. And I'll admit, like on the surface, it sounds pretty dumb as like an opening concept, but if you think about it, this is like the perfect analogy to Peter's craziest anxieties manifested and wrapped up into one nightmare story. Because as Spider-Man, he's always struggled with the idea of doing as much as he could as a hero, and not only with the fear or anxiety of that not being enough, but even with doing this, he's also constantly under the pressure of making sure that Peter Parker's life doesn't fall apart at the same time. So it's like already what seems to be crazy in this world is really and truly what Peter's been dealing with under all the layers of those quips and those jokes, and it's like we're given the visual representation of Peter having to hold everything together by himself. But along with this unraveling event that's just causing everything to unravel, like aside from us seeing Peter hold Manhattan together with his webs, we also see him going around being the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Like when he comes across this guy whose jaw has pretty much unraveled from his face, and Peter goes to find it and he brings his jaw back to this guy while webbing the guy up to kind of hold him together in the meantime. But it's also kind of wild because even though this unraveling has most people kind of like in a zombie state, Peter can also tell like the guy with the missing jaw, who's also missing an arm, that he's very much still in a stage where he's aware of what's happening to him. And it's really sad to say the least. But just after this, Peter tells the guy that he's gonna go get his arm back, and this then takes us over to Peter running into Doc Ock, who in this case is very much your classic Doc Ock at his core, but then on top of that, you then have the whole unraveling thing that's going on. So for Otto, he's a bit delirious as well, because at this point when Peter gets back to him after racing back and forth throughout the city, Otto is just waving this dude's arm around, but to Otto, he truly believes that he has a whole hostage here. But as we can see, that's clearly just not the case. But with classic Otto in this condition, there's not a lot that he can do, and it's not long before he overexerts himself and he breaks his arms back off. But even still, Peter can see that Otto just needs help, on top of the fact that he's physically falling apart. And it's real brief, but it's a bit of a touching moment moment with Otto asking Peter not to laugh, and in response, Peter takes it seriously and he tells Otto that he won't. And Peter webs Otto back together, telling him that he'll check on him the next day. But then also with Peter seeing this flare go up from the Baxter building, like it's pretty obvious that Reed Richards is sending him a message, and Peter has to rush over to check it out and see what's going on. But as soon as Peter enters the Baxter building, like he's telling Reed like, hey, you ain't got to do the whole flare thing, like I got a phone. But when Peter goes in and he sees Reed, who at this moment is looking like Reed's soup, like the return of Inside Out boy. But then it's here where Reed expresses to Peter that it's more so of a thing of him letting go of his human morphology and then pulling himself back together so that it can help his cognitive capacity for him to continue to do his work. But even with Reed saying that, I got a feeling that a couple of screws are still kind of loose here. But even still, at this point, it's about 6:14 and Peter still has to meet his wife Gwen at 7:30. So at this point, he's not really one for the extended explanations because he wants to make sure that he gets back to his wife on time. But then also we get this moment to where Reed, he questions Peter for doing this whole anniversary thing with his wife while telling Peter that his responsibility to the city is so much greater. And it's here where Peter kind of snaps because he's been doing the most out there. And he lets Reed know like, look, I sleep 3 hours if I'm lucky. I'm out here losing weight. I weigh $129 when I'm soaking wet. And he's literally out there webbing up and holding this city together by himself, only for a few hours later for his webbing to dissolve, to where he then has to go back out there and do it all over again, while Reed is just cooped up in here putting his insides on the outside. And when this happens, like more or less, Peter, he just lets Reed know, don't talk to me about responsibility. I'll stop having dinners with my wife when you fix this damn unraveling. And I'm paraphrasing of course, but you guys kind of get where it's going. But then it's here where Reed shows Peter his recent solution for the unraveling, or at least something to help with Peter's contribution to all the chaos outside. Because for the time being, with Peter trying to web everything up and hold it together, his webbing will stay for like 3 hours before it dissolves, which for Peter is like the maximum amount of time that he'll get to sleep if he's lucky. And at this point, Peter's talked to Otto about extending the length of time that his webs could last, but like we've seen, Otto's head really isn't all together at this moment, so that's a no-go. But it's here where Reed shows Peter that he's constructed a self-healing organic polymer that can theoretically replace Peter's web fluid. But on top of that, to also help, Reed applied a special enzyme to make it adhesive so that it'll work much like Peter's existing web fluid, but instead of it dissolving in 3 hours, this solution will hold up indefinitely. But then it's here where Peter's kind of like, okay, well, what exactly is this made of? And casually Reed just tells him like, it's my finger. And when I seen this, I was kind of like, whoa, man, like Reed, you need to get out more, man, like that's not the move. And Peter's response more or less just wasn't too different. But with Reed showing the solution to Peter, that much how like Peter was saved from the unraveling by his healing factor, Reed was able to hold himself together because of his elastic molecular structure. And Reed tells Peter that there are others out there with this elastic molecular structure that Peter needs to find and bring to Reed so that Reed can combine their structure with this enzyme so that all these webs will hold up and finally Peter can get some rest. But also when Reed says this, Peter then realizes why Reed has the old sonic gun out, and after having this talk, Peter immediately goes after Venom. And at this point it's like 7:04, Peter's running tight on time and his wife Gwen calls. And at first she just lets him know like, don't forget the cider vinegar. And then she starts to say that something's wrong, but Peter doesn't pay much attention to it. He knows he got to be back by 7:30, so he's really just rushing to get this done so he can get back to his wife in time. But as far as Peter looking for Venom right now, who at this point has been missing since the beginning of the unraveling, and for reasons that we'll find out momentarily, because when Venom gets the drop on Peter down here in the sewer, he immediately destroys the sonic gun, which right away takes Peter's options off the table as far as him getting this done in a quick and neat fashion. But Peter also notices that when Venom attacks him here, he's not as strong as he's used to Venom being. So right away Peter's like, okay, so Venom's either pulling his punches or Eddie's in bad shape. But with the sonic gun being broken at this point, Peter just pulls the roof down on the both of them, and with doing this he tells Eddie like, look, I need the symbiote, this is bigger than the both of us, and he lets Eddie know like he'll pry it off of him if he has to. But when Peter says this, the Venom symbiote opens up and it shows Peter that Eddie's dead, and the symbiote's been trying to hold Eddie or preserve him or keep him fresh for as long as possible, only to have Eddie still die. And with seeing this, Peter was just like, well, why didn't you just go and find another host? And the Venom symbiote tells Peter like, you don't get it, you never did. Because for the Venom symbiote, Eddie was more than just a host, because when they met each other they were both broken, and at that time the two of them coming together, it was like they each were the perfect solution of what the other needed to heal. And as the Venom symbiote goes on to explain to Peter on how it couldn't just leave Eddie, because Eddie was more than a host, it was his home, and there was just something about that loyalty that just struck a chord with Peter, because this love and this loyalty that the Venom symbiote had learned to where now it won't leave Eddie even after it's too late, and it more or less has Peter like, man, like you definitely didn't learn that from me. And in this moment, Peter tells the symbiote that he's sorry, and that he can be that for the Venom symbiote now, because he wasn't ready before, but Peter says that he's ready now. And when he says this, the Venom symbiote starts to reach for him, but then it stops, it says no, and it stays with Eddie. And when this happens, Peter kind of stands there for a moment, he takes it in, with him not only seeing a reflection of a moment where he had fell short, but with him also realizing that it's 7:46 and he's late for his anniversary dinner with his wife, Gwen. And when he realizes this, he then just races off. And on his way to meet his wife, he's trying to call her, but Gwen's not picking up, and even on his way, he dropped his phone to then look at the screen and see it's 7:47. But even with him rushing to see her, he's having this feeling of deja vu, to where on one hand, he kind of knows what he's going to find when he gets there, but even still, he's rushing to get to her because he's still got to try. But nonetheless, when he makes his way to Gwen, only to find that she's succumbed to the unraveling as well, and that he had gotten back to her too late. And he missed this last moment with her because he was handling too many tasks, trying to do too much, and he missed out on what could have been their last moment together. And it kind of pulls on the heartstrings here when he blows out the candle and he's kind of like, man, I forgot the side of vinegar. And it's really like a sad moment. But after this, when he goes back to the Baxter building, Peter then more or less tells himself that there is one more thing that he has to do. And it's here where we see him go back to Reed, and Reed is more or less like, okay, well, how did it go? Any problems? Any complications? And Peter's just like, nope, nothing worth mentioning. But then from here we get this moment to where Reed, he apologizes for what he said earlier about Gwen, and then Reed apologizes for questioning Peter's priorities. But while Reed is saying this, Peter's behind him looking over the notes, checking out the enzyme, and then next thing you know, he's right behind him with a needle. But it's not long after this where we next see the city covered with webbing, but this time it has a hint of blue in it, because at this point Peter has followed through with Reed's solution, but instead of taking the Venom symbiote or anyone else with an elastic molecular structure against their will, Peter had instead used Reed and applied his own molecular structure to his own plan. And even though the solution doesn't fix the unraveling, it has stopped its progression for the time being. But at this point things are better now. Doc Ock, he's back to robbing banks, thanks to Peter. And it's kind of funny seeing Doc Ock rob banks again, because that's a throwback to how he used to fund his research. But it is also here towards the end of this story to where Peter can still hear Reed Richards calling out and saying like, Peter, it hurts. Because Reed Richards is not dead, but instead he can feel himself stretched across the entire city, with him more or less becoming a type of sentient webbing that is always in pain. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all of your support. And for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below to where you can go to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again in the next one. Alright, later.